Hello, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's Thinking. My name is Alexi Mostrous. I'm a partner here at Tortoise. Thank you to Teneo for helping us put on this Thinking. We're very grateful to them. The title is The Great Global Economic Unlearning. Is everything we've learned suddenly wrong? And I was thinking about the title today, and I felt instinctively quite cynical about it, because it's easy for journalists especially to package up a whole bunch of stuff and say it's unprecedented, when in actual fact, most events have historical precedents, or at least it's the case that our historical knowledge can help us determine what the next course of action, what the best course of action should be. But then again, there are some very clever people out there who believe that COVID-19 especially has upended traditional economic thinking, and some of the actions taken by world governments in the past 20 months or so have seemed to rip up the rule book in certain areas, especially in terms of spending and debt. So I suppose the question for us today is, how unprecedented economically, politically is the time that we're living in? And if it is unprecedented, then what can we do about it? What are the new rules of the game? So luckily, we've got three great guests to discuss this. Vicky Pryce is a superstar economist and board member at the Centre of Economics and Business Research, along with many other roles and titles that I can't fit in here. Jack Farchy is the co-author of The World for Sale, a brilliant book about the commodity traders who barter the Earth's resources. And Rupert Russell is another author and academic whose book Price Wars are all about the chaotic markets creating a chaotic world, particularly since 2010. So together, I think that we can have a go at working this out over the next hour. But as ever with the Thinking, the guests may be brilliant, but we actually want to hear from you most of all. We want to hear your points of views, your opinions, not just questions. So if you've got anything to say, please type it into chat. My colleague Seb will pick it up and we'll try and bring you into the conversation. That's when the Thinking works best, when it's not just a panel discussion, when it's a kind of collaborative event. So let's kick off maybe with Vicky. Vicky, can I kick the tires on the title of this Thinking a bit first? Because we're saying that many business experts think we're at the dawn of a new economic era, and that these concepts like low interest rates and low inflation and cheap labor are all under threat. And yes, that is true to a certain extent, but how unprecedented is it? Do you agree with the framing of this debate?
What is really interesting is that, at times of war, of course, you have government intervening quite significantly in the economy. And certainly since the Second World War, things have not been quite like that, despite, of course, the Marshall Plan and everything else, lots of money being put into Europe in particular. But what we've had seen after the creation of the welfare systems is that the governments have generally tended then to withdraw and allow businesses to, if you like, take over the private sector, fueling the economy, if you like. And what we've seen in this particular crisis, so the government has come back in a very big way. Yes, they did that in the financial crisis as well. But there have been some serious differences in terms of what we see now to what we saw in 2008, 2009, and what happened in the aftermath of the financial crisis. What seems to be going on now is not only that the share of government spending and taxation has increased, certainly here, but also elsewhere. But we've also seen that the markets have been quite relaxed about this. We had huge austerity that followed the financial crisis, the interventions from governments and central banks, which of course, delayed, if you like, the return to stability. I mean, places like Italy, for example, when the pandemic hit, we're still seeing per capita GDP below where it was before the financial crisis. Greece, where I was born, of course, was in disaster mode anyway, was only just beginning to pick up. But the amounts that have been put into the economy to tackle what looked like both a supply and demand shock have been extraordinary in the size. I mean, the US is something like 25% of GDP, here about 15% of GDP, slightly less in other parts of Europe. And the markets are relaxed. So instead of everyone saying, well, you've got to cut back now that the economy is recovering, and the economies are recovering quite strongly, everyone is encouraged to spend more. The World Bank is saying that, the IMF is saying that, the markets are prepared to lend at very low interest rates still to governments. But of course, you've also seen this huge intervention from central banks coming into the market much more aggressively than before. And again, that seems to be quite acceptable. So what is sustainable debt is being rethought. The European Central Bank has thrown out its Stability and Growth Pact stringent conditions. If only we had had COVID, of course, we wish we never had COVID, before the financial crisis, then places like Greece would not have seen that huge sort of bailouts and conditions and drop in GDP, and lots of other countries too that we saw. There seems to be some rethink of what is sustainable debt, what the role of government should be, how much they should be spending, and also how to react to inflation. Inflation is now, as you pointed out in the slides before, at something like 25, 30-year high, and yet interest rates remain very low.
So there has obviously been a shift in terms of government intervention and government attitudes towards spending since the 2008 crisis. But is that explained by the pandemic and the unique nature of the pandemic, or is it explained also by the 12 years since the crisis, or 13, 14 years actually, and the revolution or the evolution in economic thinking that has taken place since then?
There hadn't been a huge amount of evolution in economic thinking, I'm afraid, over that period. There was still, I mean, the mantra of reducing your debt and reducing your deficits and moving to balanced budgets was still very much there. So that nothing very much had changed, except, of course, that we had put as economists the sort of the monetary side and the sort of financial institution side much more into our thinking of the interconnectivity that exists, of course, across the world. So this is basically what had happened at the time. You know, there was a domino effect. If one financial institution went down in one place, then loads of others would fall as well because of the globalization that had taken place. But nevertheless, the mantra was still cut back, sort of sanctions supposedly against governments that didn't meet some of the EU's requirements. And here, of course, we had austerity for a number of years. So it hadn't changed. But I think COVID did create that sea change, if you like, in thinking, which I hope lasts. And also, of course, we have climate change. There's going to be a huge amount of extra spending that's going to be needed. And there's the realization that if we stick to the rules that we had until now, you just wouldn't be able to fund what is required. A transition to net zero is going to be very costly, and it is going to require a lot of subsidies and investment from the government too, working alongside business.
If you, we're going to come to Jack and to Rupert in a second, but I just want to stick on this theme of sustainable debt and the kind of the sea change in government thinking post COVID. As an economist, I mean, we're talking about unlearning commonly held assumptions that have been held for years, if not decades. What kind of economic assumptions now and going forward just don't apply anymore?
Remember, of course, the EU itself, and I've seen a number of comments coming through the chat, was thinking that 60% of debt to GDP ratio was what is sustainable. Well, the IMF had reworked it a bit and thought maybe 90%. But when you have quite low interest rates, if they remain, of course, and they remained low for a period because of globalization, lower costs of anything that you're inputting and so on. So if we move away from globalization, maybe all that will change, but let's hope not. But we were able to keep prices at relatively low levels, and therefore interest rates were also quite low. Remember, throughout the whole period of the austerity crisis, the highest interest rates was 0.75%. So if you borrow so cheaply, then you can service your debt very cheaply as well, even if your debt increases quite considerably. And yet that thinking had just not permeated through the IMF or the World Bank, and certainly not the EU either, or the Treasury here in the UK and in the US, of course, the Fed. But it's all now has changed. If interest rates remain low, it is obvious that higher debt levels are sustainable. And if they then lead to some returns anyway, government spending, for example, leading to serious improvement in terms of renewable generation of energy and so on, which will perhaps cut some of the costs for the future, then those are quite serious projects which will give the right returns, and therefore, borrowing to work alongside businesses to achieve those is justifiable. So that change has taken place, I think, in thinking now. It didn't throughout the whole of the period before, and that was very worrying. But now I think that change has happened, and I just hope that we won't suddenly go back to normality, if you like.
Thank you so much. That's a really kind of refreshing view of where we are, but it's one that may be challenged either by our guests or by our audience. I want to bring in a second Meg Thomas and Bruce Davis, both of whom have made excellent points in the chat. But I can also see that Rupert Russell has his yellow Zoom hand raised, which means that he wants to come in. Which means that I will go to him now and ask him for his response to what Vicky has said.
Yeah, thanks, Vicky, for that. That was super clear. The only thing I wanted to add was just some of the politics of this, which I looked up. I was sort of writing up my book during the pandemic, and the sort of the politics of this austerity, as far as I could make it out, was sort of an alliance between three different groups that really kind of got going in the late 1970s. Central banks, as you mentioned, the financial markets, and of course the conservative movement. And you kind of get a fusion of these three different sort of interest groups or actors, if you like, in the political economy. This happens across the West, but in particular in the United States. And so you have the central banks will be raising rates to punish governments. Maybe it was Bill Clinton under Greenspan who sort of threatened to spend a little bit more money. Of course, the financial markets react negatively as well to that. And then you've got the conservative movement kind of beating a more kind of ideological drum. And these were kind of all aligned for almost sort of 40 years. And I think what was interesting during the pandemic is you begin to see this kind of alliance untangle. So in the very first sort of that 2020 spring, those sort of big stimulus packages you start seeing across the West, you sort of see conservatives, the banks and the financial markets all going, okay, we're in this, as you said, like a kind of wartime mentality. Let's have war communism, whatever they wanted to call it. And the problem was it worked, right? That was the huge problem for the conservatives, was they actually went out, spent this money, the financial markets didn't freak out, the central banks were okay with it, and it was successful. And so what you begin seeing by that summer of 2020 is the conservative movement realizing we've let the cat out of the bag here. People are going to start asking for more stuff, right? They're going to start asking, maybe we're going to give more benefits to working people. Maybe we're going to start spending money on the climate crisis, whatever the new spending priorities are. And so you have these conservatives begin freaking out in the summer of 2020. So in the United States, you had Lindsey Graham saying, over my dead body, are we going to spend like another $1? You have this really bizarre situation where the Republicans running up to a national election are like refusing to spend any more money. The Democrats are quite happy to do it. The Republicans are going against it, even though they would be the beneficiaries. They're also refusing to boast about the successes they've had, right? This is like a key thing for them. And in the UK as well, you see the same thing. You see, Rishi Sunak saying, we have a sacred duty to pay back the money that the Bank of England had essentially printed to kind of finance the furlough and so forth. And so you're kind of seeing this unraveling. And so what you're seeing across the West is this sort of fracturing now between central bankers and the financial markets being happier with increased spending as long as it's in places that they approve of. Maybe climate change is one of those. And you're seeing the conservative wing of this sort of fight back quite aggressively. And I guess how things play out will just be, what the sort of shifting alliance looks like. And if the conservatives can once again get the central bankers and the financial markets on their side or not.
And Rupert, in your research, did you see any kind of economic precedents for this sort of debate, which would give us a clue as to which way it was going to go?
I don't think there's anything at least I can see in the tea leaves. I'm not maybe smart enough, but definitely every time there is one of these crises, whether it was the 1930s or the 1970s or after the Second World War, there's always a kind of, in the midst of crisis, everybody's trying to define it, right? Whether it's conservatives, liberals, progressives, socialists, business interests, the central bank, technocrats, economic profession, everyone's trying to define what is the crisis, what's the cause of it, and how to get out of it. And usually aligns with people's pre-existing beliefs, right? So if you're like a libertarian, the problem's always the government, it's always the Federal Reserve out of control. If you're on the left, it's always, well, there's too much austerity, there's too much monopoly or oligopoly power. So I think what ends up happening is that each of these crises ends up being opportunities of like definition. And that's more of a political process than an economic one. And I think more often than not, the wrong people win, so to speak. I think that was definitely the case in the 70s, in my opinion, but we'll see.
And you write a lot in your book about the last decade being particularly chaotic for a number of kind of interlocking reasons. Do the new economic rules that we've been speaking about, this increased comfort with spending and debt, do they make it more likely that parts of the world will become more chaotic?
I don't think so. I don't think there's necessarily a one-to-one correspondence. I think the end of austerity is, if it is ending, is a good thing and should be encouraged in its own right. When we look at things like what I was looking at was the price shocks globally, so food price shocks, oil price shocks, and I think that's a deeper question about our economy, the financialization of our economy. What's the point of our economy? What are we trying to make? Are we trying to make financial products? Or are we trying to make physical things people can use, or sort of services? So I think end of austerity is a good thing, but looking at price volatility, that's a much deeper question about the role of finance and regulation in the economy.
Okay, thank you. Well, let's bring in a couple of people from the chat. Is Meg Thomas around? Hey, Meg.
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Well, I mean, first of all, I need to put my hand up and say I don't know anything about economics or even money. But I did go to medical school in the 1970s, and I've just retired actually, and sort of got a bit of survivor guilt going on. But we did learn, we were told that there would be a pandemic during our working lives, and that was only slightly wrong. So I'm thinking, I mean, we've mentioned previous economic crises a little bit, but what about previous pandemics? I'm quite interested in the history of medicine, and I heard that after the Black Death, which was absolutely centuries ago, that was actually quite good for workers' rights, because they had to be paid more because there were fewer people, because the death rate was so high. I mean, that's just one little example. But I wonder if we know anything about, say, Spanish flu, as it was called, because that was only 100 years ago, and I just don't know how relevant it is, because, as I'll say, I know nothing about economics. So
no, but yeah, you raise a really, really interesting question. I mean, I'm going to come. I know, Vicky, you're probably not an expert in economic change following medical crises, but is there anything that you've seen that shows us or suggests how a society can change in terms of these sort of basic rules after a big crisis like this?
Yes, I think there are a few examples, and there's a really good question. Of course, just think about the Second World War, and so many men died or were out at war, so women started being used a lot more in the workplace. And as soon as men came back, and many of them lost those positions, but there was a shift in attitudes which one could build upon after that. And of course, as economists, we know full well that there is the lump of labor fallacy. In other words, there isn't just a limited number of jobs that people can do, but certainly crises like that change perceptions. And I think women, if you wouldn't go, even though they lost obviously loved ones, benefited from that over a period of time. So this type of thing happens when you lose quite a lot of members of the workforce, which I think is what was being suggested. Leads to those reactions. The second thing is, in crisis, of course, quite a lot of wealth is destroyed. And when we look at the financial crisis before, it looked like you got better equality, because we have Piketty's concerns about capitalism and so on, what it does, but even he, in his book, talks about the times when wealth was destroyed at various times of crisis. So if the stock market goes down very significantly, if the economy really looks like crashing, then quite a lot of people suffer who had a lot of wealth, and you have this type of better equality. And that actually is what happened with the financial crisis itself. What's happening now, we thought the same thing might happen again as we saw then. Is another thing of unlearning, but the type of crisis we had, which led to very, very low interest rates again, which of course helped asset prices significantly, is that the asset rich people did incredibly well. Those who just relied on incomes or had to go out and work or were renting didn't. So that type of inequality has increased on the wealth side. And we've ended up, because of the way we were using IT and so on, with all those, the 10, as we know, the 10 richest billionaires doubling their billions since the crisis, the pandemic started. So it's a slightly different change has taken place. The only positive thing then, additionally, thinking about women, is that, of course, with working from home, you might be able to increase flexibility, and therefore, women may have greater access than they did before. But that's to be proven still, in my view.
Meg, do you want to come back on that? You had your hand up.
Possibly. I was just thinking about how it seems that the public in general appreciate the lower paid people a lot more, the care workers, the delivery people, the people in supermarkets, but I can't see any sign that that's going to be reflected in paying them better. But could that be a thing?
If I can say, yeah, it's if I'm still unmuted, I can say that.
Go ahead.
It's a very, very good point. The trouble is, it hasn't really happened. What we've seen, of course, there are these well-known cases of HGV drivers being offered all sorts of things to sign up and drive those lorries that are needed. But in reality, if you look at average earnings and how they've increased, there is a big discrepancy. So where the increases have been above inflation have been in the financial sector, in business services, and not in manufacturing, and certainly not in the public sector, where there has been, of course, this pay freeze anyway of sorts, and which, although it gets relaxed, is still going to keep those wage increases below inflation. So we haven't seen that improvement, except, of course, increasing minimum wage, which is quite helpful, but otherwise, no. If anything, the discrepancy in terms of wages has increased.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, since you've been talking, there have been a number of really good comments in the chat that we really want to try and bring into the conversation. I know that Jack has been waiting very patiently to speak, and he's got his hand up as well. So we're going to come into him in just a second. But first of all, I just wanted to bring in Bruce Davis, who has been making points about cost of living in the chat. Bruce, if you're there, do you just want to make your point to camera?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I guess it was trying to understand this, fairly complex set of levers. I'm not an economist, but I run a finance company that makes long-term investments. And I think the bit that we are sort of grappling with is you've got a short-term, very real cost of living increase that you can measure, mainly driven by energy prices, but other things connected to that. And that affects people's ability to spend across the spectrum. And then on the other side, you've got inflation expectations. So where are those prices going? And that's what affects what central banks do, and particularly on interest rates and the cost of money. And therefore, investors start to make different decisions. So whereas before they were looking at, willing to back long-term growth stories, when you raise the cost of money, you effectively decrease those future returns, because money now becomes more valuable than money in the future, relatively speaking. So there's these sort of big kind of undercurrents going on that we're still seeing the outcome on in the markets. A bit of a shift in terms of, I think, a bit of a shift in terms of the value investors versus growth investors, if those are two big schools of thought. But I think from our perspective, my investors are sort of looking at this as that maybe the unlearning is that maybe this isn't the time to be encouraging ourselves to spend our way out of this crisis, but actually to invest our way out of this crisis. And that's a lot of the arguments that have been put forward under sort of Green New Deal, saying that we're actually, we've got a bit of a problem at the moment, that we seem to be prioritizing, cash savings and talking about deposit rates, when really we should be looking at how much money is being invested in the economy, particularly by small investors as well as big investors. And in the long run, we will be better off. So it's really around that at the moment we kind of seem to be rather stuck in a mantra that says, that the best thing we can do is to be consumers. It may actually be the case that the best thing we could be is to start to learn again to be investors. But then you have, just picking up on one of the points there earlier about the crisis in this sort of framing, is that we've kind of put all the costs of that last crisis onto those individuals through austerity and everything else, and now we're expecting them to sort of invest our way out of it. I think it does come back to what people are saying around the purpose of that financial system, and who is it serving? Is it serving the financial system, or is it serving wider society? And maybe the thing we need to unlearn is maybe we shouldn't look quite so closely at how stable our financial system is if it's causing instability elsewhere. And the big instability that I see is around our democracies, that we feel like money is outside of our control, these decisions are taken above our heads. People like Mario Draghi have to be brought in to stabilize whole countries because there used to be a central banker. And that's a big shift in terms of the power that money has versus where we were before. And maybe the unlearning is, how do democracies take back control of their financial systems again? Because at the moment, it rather feels like the shoe's on the other foot.
That is so interesting. Okay, so but let me ask you. So, in terms of the relationship between a stable financial system and political instability more widely, are we in a worse place or a better place than, say, 2008, 2010, when you did have this austerity?
I'd say we're in a worse place because we framed the financial crisis as a financial crisis and not a democratic one. So what transpired from that is that a lot of power was taken away from people and given to the financial markets. We said the financial markets are what matters. What matters is that they keep growing. It doesn't matter that wages don't keep growing. It doesn't matter that living standards fall. So we've very much said what the priorities are of that financial system, and we don't care about the environment for 10 years. Now they suddenly do. So I think that's the bits where it's changed. So and going back to that, so I've got a book myself where we studied the relationship between democracy and finance, and you can see this. The emergence of democracy came from financial reform. So in Athens, they stopped putting people into slavery if they couldn't pay their debts, and that's the basis on which you build a citizen body. If powerful people can put you into slavery, then your citizen body is somewhat undermined. And there was a guy called Solon who worked that one out in the 6th century BC. We seem to be moving back towards that whip hand being given to creditors again. And that's not good for democracy, in my view.
Well, I think Bruce, you're like a kind of platonic ideal example of why we want to bring people in from the audience to talk during Thinkings, because it's such a, going back to Athens and the 6th century BC, it's a very refreshing approach to this debate. Okay, let's bring in Jack. Jack, tell us what you think about all this. How unprecedented are the times we're living in? How much do we have to unlearn?
Well, I should start off by saying that I too am not an economist, but I can certainly talk a bit about what's going on in commodity markets, but actually I wanted to just come back on what both Vicky and Rupert were saying. It seems from what you're both saying that there's been a shift in the perception of what is an acceptable level of government debt, and therefore what's an acceptable level of government spending, and the view that as long as interest rates are low, actually we can hold much higher levels of government debt. What happens to that when interest rates rise, though? Or is the argument that actually now central bankers' hands are going to be tied when it comes to raising interest rates? And so, the situation which we have now, where inflation is running pretty hot, are central banks now not going to be able to raise interest rates as much, because to do so will be to push the governments of their countries towards insolvency?
So, okay, that was, I mean, why don't we pause there and see what Vicky thinks of that, and then what Rupert thinks of that, and then I'm going to come back to you, Jack, and ask you about your book and your findings.
It's a very good point, because what we're seeing right now is that, for example, the Bank of England, which raised interest rates before the US or the Europeans did, was almost pushed into a corner by the markets in a way, because of the statements they had made that inflation was no longer transitory, it's going to stay here for some time. But remember, they still only raise interest rates very, very little. And there are now even suggestions, because of some slowdown we've seen in the US economy, that maybe we're not going to have sort of 4 increases in interest rates this year in the US, but only maybe 3. But and if we have an increase, it's going to be bringing rates up to just over 1%. So we're not talking about anything major, nevertheless. So even though they are pushed to raise rates, they're probably not going to raise them particularly fast. And the ECB remains concerned about growth, but of course it's got so many different countries to deal with that it worries more about deflation that it saw for such a long period of time than inflation. A lot of that could change, and I think you're absolutely right. With a bit of luck, with growth, which is really what the focus is now on, a lot of those deficits and also the pace of increasing your debt will improve. In other words, deficits will go down significantly, and the debt accumulation is going to be reduced. We're not going to be paying it back, but certainly it will be reduced. And there's a debt to GDP ratio that might also change, which will make the markets feel quite happy. There is no doubt that debt will continue to increase overall. Debt to GDP ratios may come down, but countries will still need to borrow and will need to borrow year after year on current projections for quite some time to come. And everything that was discussed and that Bruce talked about, which includes where to invest and so on, have to be paid for. And yes, the private investors can put some money into that too, but there is a lot of risk. And I think a partnership between government and the private sector investing in the right areas is going to be an absolute must. So therefore, my view is that, yes, of course, we need to worry if interest rates change. But at the same time, I think if we get growth, which we should do, and we are getting, then some of those, debt accumulations, if you like, will not look anything like as bad as they do right now.
And Vicky, just before I come to Rupert on that, does these ideas that you're talking about, including the idea of sustainable debt, do they apply to the developing world, or is the developing world actually much more exposed to higher debt levels?
The developing world is an issue. In fact, you're absolutely right, because I had meant to mention that. And of course, quite a lot of the developing world has been borrowing in dollars. So one of the concerns that everyone has is that if monetary policy gets tighter in the US and the dollar strengthens, which quite a lot of people are expecting, and in fact has happened up to a point, then the debt of those countries is going to look bigger, and therefore we're going to have crises like we've had before. So that is a big concern. But what has happened is that both the World Bank and the IMF seem to be more relaxed about that, in the sense that they have been lending more to those developing countries, particularly to bolster their health systems, and with few conditions attached in terms of what they need to do to get back to normality. And also quite a large part of what they've been giving them is grants rather than debt that has to be repaid. And also the debt at very low rates. So there is some hope there, but there is no doubt that we need to worry about that. And we need to worry also additionally about the vaccination rates there, and whether in fact where we might end up. This is the other issue, is that we were seeing, certainly in the last decade and longer, inequalities between countries actually reducing. It's just possible that as a result of COVID and everything else that's happened, inequalities between countries might increase again. And that's one to watch.
Okay, thank you. Well, let's turn to Rupert quickly to get his views on Jack's point, and then come back to Jack.
Sure, I'll try and be brief. There's two, it's a big question though. I'll try and be brief. I think there's two orthodoxies at stake here. And I'm not going to come down on my own, I don't have a crystal ball, but at least outline what's...
Come down on one side or the other.
But sort of what's being challenged here. I think the first question is sort of, what is debt? Are these numbers that sort of get placed onto sort of central bank balance sheets, what relationship does that have to the real world? I think that's kind of a key question people are asking now, and thanks in part to the MMT people, but I think there's like a broader push to kind of really question, is debt this big kind of scary thing? How sustainable are policies like QE or monetary financing, or whatever they're now calling it? I mean, the Bank of England's been doing QE since Brexit, right? It wasn't since the financial crisis. They've been pumping a lot of money into the economy, but they haven't been talking about it. But it's been happening. So I think that's a big debate, right? This big orthodoxy of the financial crisis, a lot of it was based on this famous sort of Reinhardt and Reinhardt book stroke paper that said if you had a debt to GDP ratio of 90%, your growth rate would slow. And then it turned out it was an Excel error. So I'm sure Vicky could talk quite a lot about that. So I think that is this question of what is debt, what is its relationship to the real world? What do these numbers mean that is printed on a piece of paper for like the number of houses we have, or how much food we can make, or how much oil we can pump out of the ground? And the second issue it gets to is another question which is coming about, which is about, is raising interest rates the answer to inflation? That was just something completely taken for granted, right? As far as I'm concerned, that was just what I thought you had to do up until very recently. People are now saying, well, if the price of cars is going up, is the solution to there not being enough cars a recession? Maybe we should build more car factories, or maybe we should make more semiconductors, right? If the problem is rising energy prices, maybe the solution is to create more energy. It's not to create unemployment so people will demand less energy. So our whole thinking about this question, I think, is changing. So I think on those two issues, the orthodoxies are definitely crumbling, and there are definitely new policy on entrepreneurs, definitely in the Biden administration, who are pushing these arguments, who are saying the solution to our problems isn't to create recessions and austerity. There might be other ways in which we can think about these in terms of much more state intervention. So if there's an energy crisis, maybe we should be pumping money into a Green New Deal to create alternative energy sources, not making millions of people unemployed, which was what we thought we had to do up until about a year ago.
Okay, so that's really helpful. Okay, so let's bring back in Jack, and then let's bring in Tom Griffiths, who's been making some really good points in the chat. Jack, there's almost too much to discuss here. It's such a kind of broad brush debate, but let's shift it into a slightly more kind of specific area of what you found reporting on your book when you were looking at the supply chain problem and the role of commodity brokers. When we talked before, I think you said that there were three things that you noticed: COVID, a commodities down cycle, and the impact of the energy transition. I just wonder, I mean, you can say whatever you want, but maybe can you put those points in a bit more context?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, our book is really a history of the last 50, 75 years and really telling the story of how commodity markets and commodity prices shape history, and how commodity traders sit in the center of that and have an enormously powerful and we believe unappreciated role therefore in shaping history. So, you know, you look at things like the last time inflation was as high as it is now was the 1970s and 1980s, the oil crises. At the heart of that, there were oil traders helping the nations of OPEC to sell their oil and to break the monopoly of the big Western oil companies over the oil market, freeing the price of oil and causing oil prices to spike higher and therefore the inflation of the 70s and 80s. What's happening today? I mean, we've got a really, I think, you know, those of us who spend our lives writing about commodity markets, it's kind of, we've been writing about nothing else for the last 18 months, but probably for people outside of that, you know, you might not be quite as familiar with some of what's going on as we are, but you know, it's been an extraordinarily dramatic rise in commodity prices since the low point of COVID in the spring of 2020. So, you know, commodity prices across the board have doubled since that point. They're at record highs. Oil prices have more than quadrupled. Gas prices are up more than 10 times. Coal prices are at records. Metals, food prices, they're all extremely high. And I think there's three things that have happened or are happening almost simultaneously. One is this enormously rapid bounce back of the global economy, fueled, of course, by all the government spending that we've been talking about earlier. And that has been exacerbated by bottlenecks in supply chains, often not helped by COVID. So, you know, ports being shut down or factories not working or borders being closed. At the same time, you've got a fairly ordinary commodity cycle going on. So commodity prices were falling and low for the kind of last 6-7 years from about 2014 to about 2020. And in that period of time, commodity producing companies, you know, the oil companies, the miners, were being told by their shareholders, invest less, spend less, give us back more cash. That kind of hit a low point in 2020 when the price of everything briefly crashed. A load of companies went bankrupt. And so now you have the result of that, which is, you know, several years of people not investing very much, or maybe not investing enough, and at the same time as demand is recovering very rapidly, and so that means prices are going up. And then the third thing, which those two things, if I'm addressing your kind of opening great unlearning question, I think those two things are fairly kind of typical of economic cycles. You know, you get bounce backs in demand after economic recessions, you get commodity cycles of overinvestment and underinvestment. Those things happen, they're normal. I think the third one that's maybe slightly less normal, and probably has the least is the least important in terms of what's happening to commodity prices today, but probably will become very important over the next few years, and I suspect is going to be a very hot political topic, as well as, you know, all of what we've been talking about until now points to inflation continuing to be a big issue, which is the energy transition. And we are beginning to see in commodity markets the impact of things like investors, certainly in some markets like Europe, not wanting to invest so much in fossil fuels, like certainly coal. There's much less capital available to invest in coal, and so that means there's been less investment in coal. Coal prices are at record highs. We're beginning to see that maybe impacting oil as well, perhaps. Certainly European oil companies are investing less, in part as a result of pressure from investors who are looking forward to an energy transition. Also, the world is beginning to start taking some steps towards putting a price on carbon, which, I mean, I would argue is absolutely necessary and overdue, but that is putting a price on something that we weren't putting a price on before. So, for example, you know, China has been, for the last 20 years, the main source of growth in global aluminium production. Aluminium, which is a metal that you find in almost everything that we use, one of the most common metals that we all use in our everyday products. The aluminium price has more or less doubled over the past year, to a large degree because China has talked about capping production, because lots of Chinese aluminium production uses energy from coal, and they want to, at least they say they want to burn less coal. If we start to get to a world where we're putting a meaningful price on carbon, that's going to make everything more expensive. So I think we're definitely all pointing in the same direction of inflation is here to stay for some time.
And what are what do the commodity traders that you speak to think of the shifts that we've been talking about in terms of government spending and the attitude towards government spending and debt? How is the loosening up, the sort of the great loosening up of government spending affecting what they do every day?
I mean, they're all delighted because they're making the best money they've ever made, because commodity traders absolutely thrive on prices moving dramatically, and prices have moved extremely dramatically in the last couple of years. So, I mean, I think just today, Archer Daniels Midland, which is one of the largest agricultural commodity traders, just reported its results, and they reported a record year. So they're thrilled.
Okay, let's bring in Tom Griffiths, if we could, because he's making a really good point in the chat. Tom, are you around?
Yeah, I'm around. I'm not a frequenter to stock markets and on the stock market floor, but listening to Vicky's analysis earlier, who obviously has a lot more insight, it seems that John Maynard Keynes is stalking these floors in Frankfurt I'm used to. And the question that gives a perspective for me, because I'm very concerned, you know, I live in the north, I live in Yorkshire, and we've lost our way in recent years in terms of the lost cotton trade, mining, all these sorts of industries. And what's the future for these areas? You know, in America, they call left behind. In here, we have lost our way, and there's often been no clear alternative to these old industries. And the question about Keynes is, when we go back to the 30s and 40s, when we were building Hoover Dams in that state, it was a much broader investment. Is the revival of Keynes now much more limited, restricted, say, to the Green New Deal, whatever that means? I'm still not sure what that means. Or is it going to be to a revival on a much broader sense, to reviving areas of the UK, I'm living in the UK, but also areas across the developing world which have been left behind or lost away in the last few years? So is it going to be a broadened revamping of those priorities, or is it going to be more narrow and focused? But from Vicky, as I say, her insights, it obviously is having an impact on the financial markets in a way which is quite impressive.
You're cutting out a little bit, Tom, but I think I've got your. Sorry. No, don't worry. I've got your point. So let's go back to Vicky on that. I mean, I suppose when I was starting to look at this this debate, I kind of considered it from a negative perspective, as in, you know, stuff that companies had relied on for quite a long time to grow, like low interest rates, like globalized labor. Certain assumptions that they made historically were now being undermined. But I think what Tom is referring to is potentially a key benefit for areas like his that could result from a rethinking about how we spend, how governments spend money. So can you just talk a little bit about that and address his point about Keynes and whether we are bringing him back into the fold and the impact of that, if that's true, on areas like his?
I think one of the people who've been commenting on this in the chat has said, I mean, Keynes has always been around, he just wasn't mentioned very much, but in fact, everything that we've seen, certainly in the last couple of years, suggests that yes, any concerns about Keynes are not applying his suggestions, but of course you can interpret Keynes in all sorts of different ways. But anyway, that has now been thrown out of the window because basically we are applying Keynesian policies, and that's what's going on, with monetary policies actually helping hugely. So of course the monetarists are screaming, saying, look at all this money you're putting into the economy, inflation of course has to go up, which up to a point they're right in this. And somebody else also in the chat said that high inflation of course means your debt is reduced in terms of real value, so that's good news. Yes, we always wanted a little bit of inflation, so I think that's all okay. So yes, Keynes is alive and well. The question is, how can we use spending in the right way? And it was mentioned earlier in terms of where do you invest and how do you invest to ensure that various regions also benefit. And also we talked about the developing countries. Well, there are serious problems with this because once you old industries go, getting new ones there takes a bit of time. And we've seen a number of parts of the UK doing quite well in terms of financial services, where a lot of back office stuff is being done, credit card stuff and so on. We've seen the government move a bit of their offices elsewhere, but the reality is that it does take time to get through this transition where new green, whatever that is, industry can survive. But in fact, what we're really talking about is that everything we do of manufacturing is done in a different way than before and is more green. Yes, the government can encourage various companies, like it has done, to locate in particular parts, maybe the red wall seats that it wants to make sure that there are jobs there. But in reality, what you need, we don't know what types of industries there will be in the future. In reality, what makes the greatest difference in regions in terms of growth and productivity is to have good infrastructure and high skills that stay there. And then industries will, move into, or companies will move into those areas because they will have that type of backdrop, if you like, that will allow them to do well. And that's what needs to be done. And there are huge differences in infrastructure and in skills across the UK. And I think that's where the focus, frankly, should be. And the real problem, again, coming out of COVID, assuming we are coming out of COVID, of course, given that we now hear about new variants, is that because of everything that's happened, the fall in GDP in various areas, the loss of particular types of production and so on, the cost of levelling up is now increasing very significantly. So if anything, the government may need to either borrow more or entice even more businesses to go into there with subsidies to make some of that levelling up really work. And we're waiting for the levelling up white paper, of course, to come out. But in reality, it's going to be a very costly and long-term effort, I'm afraid. And what happens in developing countries, of course, they've got to adapt to climate change as well, and we're not really transferring the amount of money we promised we would do to them to be able to adapt. So I share his pessimism, I'm sorry to have to say, in this. It's going to be long and hard, but at least if the emphasis can be on the right things, infrastructure and skills, then there is some hope.
Okay, thank you, Vicky. Rupert's got his hand up, so I would like to bring in Tom McCallum if I could, and then Rupert. But first, Vicky, can I just ask you a question that kind of sounds probably quite simple, given the complexity of some of the stuff we've been talking about. But inflation, it's at a kind of 10-year, 20-year high. It could go up. I mean, when I think of inflation, I think of things like negative equity and impact on mortgages and all sorts of negative effects. So, but how worried should we be about rising inflation?
Okay, but the first thing is what the reactions of the government and the central banks might be. If they raise interest rates significantly, then that's a problem. The truth is, of course, with the inflation that we're seeing at present, coming, as we heard earlier, from energy and commodity prices going up, us raising interest rates isn't going to really make very much difference to this, won't make a dent. And therefore, I do not expect interest rates to go up too much to counter this. And also there's the question, yes, of course, energy prices may stay elevated for a while, but the question is how you measure inflation. Inflation, if you do it on a yearly basis, is the price you see right now over a year ago. Now, of course, we know that commodity prices, we heard earlier, were negative at some point during 2020. Oil prices were negative. Now, of course, they're higher than pre-pandemic levels. But if they stay where they are, or even if they go up a little bit, then the increase, even in gas prices, for example, which of course depend hugely on geopolitics, Russia, Ukraine, and so on. Let's assume they stay where they are, high, elevated, costing businesses and so on. On the inflation front, if you look a year hence, if they stay where they are in a year's time, inflation will be zero. So because it's on a year, so it's the base that you look at that matters hugely. So, and I think central bankers are looking at this. It's one of the reasons why they're being quite careful about raising rates too much, because if you look ahead, even the World Bank projections for inflation for next year for commodity prices, and of course, you know, that may be wrong, is that if they rise, they will only rise a little bit by comparison to where they are now, which is at a very elevated level. So, so there is an argument that maybe we shouldn't worry too much. But of course, on mortgages, if you have this inflation, house prices go up, whatever mortgage you took has a lot less value in the future. So you can afford it a lot more. So there is an affordability issue there too. But of course, it does affect food prices, what people spend, disposable incomes. Yes, we need to worry about that. But on the pure inflation front, I think what I said is that it is an international phenomenon. It's exogenous factors, if you like, that affect that to a point. As long as inflation expectations don't just rise very significantly, and we're stuck with that type of increase sort of happening every year, then I think we needn't worry inordinately about it.
Oh, thank you, especially as the owner of a very big mortgage. That's quite comforting to hear. I can see Rupert's got his hand up. Let's just quickly bring in Tom McCallum, if possible. You're saying something quite interesting about the need for education in these areas.
I'll be brief because I'm watching the time. But first, I have to say, Alexi, well done on the best podcast I've ever listened to, my friend. Long time tortoise participant. My thoughts are on inflation, and specifically that we can educate the younger generation, by which I'm saying roughly 45 and under, academically, but without lived experience, it has an impact on our profile for risk. My first mortgage, I was 22. And within 6 months, the interest rate on my mortgage went to 15%. If you're under 45, listen, that means beans on toast and not being able to heat your place, right? It then dropped back down and you have that experience, right? And there's a massive risk profile issue, very prevalent in the UK and the London market with buy-to-let properties. People think they're always going to go up in value, and they've got these fixed rate mortgages. So my simple point is that it's very important whether or not we're on team transitory, as my economist friend Megan Green is, or whether we're on team here to stay. It's very important as part of this picture, we educate ourselves on economics. My core point is simply this: those who've lived through it will have a different risk tolerance around consideration of this. Other people will just wait till it hits.
Thank you so much. That's and thanks for the compliment about the podcast as well. Let's give the last word to Rupert. It seems like one of the points that Tom was making was that, you know, this is more about relearning rather than unlearning. Do you want to come back on anything that you'd heard?
Well, that was a point. There's a small point I wanted to make was precisely on that. And what I found so interesting about, you know, especially in the UK, you know, there's a lot of talk about coming out of the EU and we're going to now have industrial policy, right? It really is a movement of economics away from the invisible hand and back to politicians and sort of democracy, and we're going to decide what kind of country and what kind of economy we're going to have. But what's sort of amazing is nobody seems to have any ideas, right? It's like our imagination has been completely hollowed out of 40 years of being told the government cannot invest, the government cannot make these decisions, the market always knows best, the market is what you want, you know, knows about long-term investment. And then, you know, if you're just an ordinary person in Britain, you're looking around and you're like, well, you know, maybe we should maybe build some more houses, or you're looking at, you know, science, you know, you're looking at maybe Wide magazine and you're thinking, antibiotics, maybe we like need some money in these, right? There's quite a lot of low-hanging fruit of things that any ordinary person can see we need investment into, but the market, for lots of reasons, doesn't do that. And I think there's a huge disconnect between our political class that has like forgotten how to do sort of industrial policy, and then so many needs that we have to direct money into. These mRNA vaccines, for example, were just sort of sitting around on the shelf. It wasn't until COVID that they got the money they needed to really get these platforms up and running. And like now they are up and running, fantastic. Hopefully we can, you know, prevent lots more diseases. But I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit around here if only we had the political imagination to go and get it.
Thank you very much, and thank you to everyone who has joined today. I feel a bit like I've been kind of hanging on to this debate with my fingertips, because I think I've kind of got my head around maybe 15% of what we were discussing, but it certainly seems like something fundamental is changing, and it was just very interesting to hear the perspectives not only of Rupert and of Jack and of Vicky, but you know, it's been a great discussion within the comment section as well, from Tom, from Meg, from Bruce Davis, from Chris, from everyone that contributed, and hopefully, you know, we've only had an hour on this, but it's these sort of discussions that I think are kind of helpful in helping us, especially non-economists, understand a bit about what's going on in 2022 and beyond. So thank you so much for participating. Thank you to Teneo for helping us put on this discussion. The next thinking in the Teneo series will take place on the 22nd of February. It's called How Can Responsible Businesses Ensure They Approach AI in the Right Way? It's got some great speakers, including the head of AI at PwC. Seb will share a link to that in the comment section now. And then this evening, we are going to be talking about Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner. Can the odd couple work together? And it's hosted by our own Laura Spirit. So please join us for that, and Seb will send a link to that thinking as well. In the meantime, have a wonderful day, and hopefully we'll speak to you soon.